Imagine a snowstorm trapping you in a cabin, miles from help, with only the howling wind and eerie creaks of the floorboards for company. Imagine footprints in the snow leading to your window, but never away. Imagine a winter night so silent, even the slightest sound sends chills down your spine. These are not just stories. They are chilling experiences that some wish they could forget. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll uncover 3 disturbing, true winter horror stories that will leave you frozen with fear. So grab a warm blanket, settle in, and let's dive into these spine-tingling tales. Story 1, The Frozen Stranger by Marcus Dillard. It was January 2018, the dead of winter in Montana, when Marcus Dillard decided to embark on one of his favorite pastimes, winter hiking. Glacier National Park, with its vast, snow-covered trails and breathtaking views, was Marcus's sanctuary. An experienced outdoorsman, he had hiked these trails countless times before, but this trip was different. The winter air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive, and the snow-covered trees seemed to lean in closer than usual. Marcus planned a solo overnight trip, aiming to camp near Hidden Lake. Armed with thermal gear, a high-powered flashlight, a GPS, and plenty of food, he felt prepared. The first day of hiking went as planned. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the snow-covered terrain. Marcus enjoyed the solitude, breathing in the crisp, icy air. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. As night approached, Marcus set up his campsite. The temperature plummeted, but he managed to start a small fire, using it to cook his dinner. It was during this time, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, that he noticed something unusual: footprints in the snow. At first, he thought they might belong to another hiker, but upon closer inspection, the tracks didn't look right. They were far too large to be human, with an odd, elongated shape. The prints circled his campsite and then disappeared into the trees. Uneasy but logical, Marcus brushed it off. Bears and moose were common in the area, and although rare in the dead of winter, it wasn't impossible. Later that night, as Marcus lay in his sleeping bag, he struggled to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Just as he began to drift off to sleep, a noise jolted him awake. It was the unmistakable sound of crunching snow. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Heart pounding, Marcus reached for his flashlight. Unzipping the tent as quietly as possible, he shone the beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and snow. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, he thought he might be imagining things. But then he looked down. Fresh footprints, human and barefoot, led away from his tent. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The prints were deep, indicating whoever, or whatever, had made them was heavy, and they were barefoot. In this weather, such a thing was impossible, or deadly. Adrenaline surged through him. Marcus quickly packed up his gear, deciding it was safer to leave the area and hike back to his car. As he made his way through the forest, the silence seemed to press down on him. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the crunch of snow underfoot, felt amplified. Then came the whispers. At first, Marcus thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were faint, like voices carried on the breeze, but he couldn't make out the words. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, disorienting him. Finally, after what felt like hours, Marcus reached the trailhead where his car was parked. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking from the cold and fear. As he started the engine and turned on the headlights, he glanced back toward the forest. That's when he saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, with long limbs that didn't look quite human. Its face was pale, almost glowing in the dark, and its eyes seemed to pierce right through him. Marcus didn't wait to see what would happen next. He threw the car into gear and sped down the icy road, his tires skidding slightly as he fled the scene. He didn't stop driving until he reached his home hours later. For days, Marcus couldn't shake the experience. He replayed it in his mind, trying to make sense of what he saw. He even returned to the area weeks later, during daylight, to see if he could find an explanation. but the snow had long since covered any evidence of what had happened that night. To this day, Marcus refuses to hike alone in the winter. He doesn't share his story often, fearing people will dismiss it as a hallucination or an overactive imagination. But deep down, Marcus knows the truth. Something was out there with him that night, something that wasn't human, and he barely escaped with his life. Story 2, The Cabin in the Blizzard by Lila Thompson. Lila Thompson had always loved the idea of escaping the chaos of city life to spend a weekend in a cozy, secluded cabin. In February 2016, she decided to make that dream a reality. She rented a small cabin in Vermont, nestled deep in the woods. It was picturesque, with its snow-covered roof, a stone fireplace, and the promise of complete solitude. The first day was perfect. Lila enjoyed the warmth of the fire, sipping on hot cocoa while reading her favorite book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. But as evening approached, the weather began to shift. The wind grew harsher and heavy snow started falling. The forecast had mentioned a light snowstorm, but this was quickly escalating into a full-blown blizzard. By nightfall, the power flickered and eventually went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Lila wasn't overly concerned. She had a flashlight, candles, and a fully charged phone. She wrapped herself in blankets and tried to make the best of it, finding the silence of the storm oddly calming. That calmness didn't last long. Around midnight, Lila was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It came from the front door. Groggy and confused, she checked her phone. It was 12:14 a.m. Who could possibly be out in this weather? The thought of someone lost and seeking shelter crossed her mind, but fear gnawed at her. The storm outside was deafening, the wind howling like a wild animal. The banging came again, louder this time. Mustering her courage, Lila grabbed her flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response, just the relentless sound of the wind. She peeked through the small frosted window on the door. At first, all she could see was snow swirling in the darkness. Then movement caught her eye. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the porch light. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure was tall and motionless, like it was staring right at her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" she shouted, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Still no response. The figure didn't move. Lila's instinct screamed at her not to open the door. Instead, she locked it, double-checking the deadbolt. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She sat by the fireplace, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline, trying to convince herself it was just a stranded hiker. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Hours passed and Lila didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made her jump. Just as she began to think the figure might have left, the banging returned. This time it was coming from the back door. Her blood ran cold. There was no way someone could have made it around the cabin so quickly in the thick snow. Shaking, she crept toward the back door and shone her flashlight through the window. The figure was there again, closer this time, but still shrouded in shadows. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying her. Terrified, Lila ran to her room and barricaded the door with a dresser. She sat on the floor, her phone clutched in her hand. She tried calling 911, but the storm had knocked out all signals. She was completely cut off. The banging continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes at the windows, sometimes back at the front door. Lila couldn't understand how it was possible. Whoever or whatever, it was seemed unaffected by the storm. When dawn finally broke, the storm eased and sunlight began to filter through the trees. Summoning what little courage she had left, Lila ventured outside to look for footprints, hoping for some logical explanation. But there were none. The fresh snow was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. Lila didn't stay another night. She packed her things and left as quickly as she could, her heart racing with every step toward her car. She never returned to that cabin, and to this day, she can't explain what happened that night. Story 3, The Shadow on the Ice by Ethan Grayson. In the winter of 2019, Ethan Grayson, a wildlife photographer, took a trip to the remote stretches of northern Alaska. His goal was to capture the stark beauty of the tundra and perhaps catch a glimpse of the elusive Arctic fox. He rented a small cabin near a frozen lake, miles away from the nearest town. The isolation didn't bother Ethan. It was part of the adventure. The first few days went as planned. Ethan spent his time trekking across the icy terrain, snapping pictures of the stunning wilderness. The silence of the tundra was both eerie and peaceful, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird. On his third evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he noticed something strange. Out on the frozen lake, there was a figure, tall and dark, standing unnaturally still. Ethan stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't an animal, and it didn't look like another person. The figure seemed to blend into the shadows, barely visible against the dim light of dusk. Thinking it was a trick of the light, Ethan dismissed it and went back inside. That night, the wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows. Ethan was used to the sounds of nature, but something about the wind felt off, like there were voices hidden within it. He tried to sleep, but was awoken around 2 a.m. by a sharp knocking sound. The noise came from the back window. Ethan froze, his heart racing. He lived for adventure, but this was something else. Grabbing his flashlight, he hesitated before shining it toward the window. For a moment, he saw nothing but the reflection of the room. Then, just as he was about to look away, he saw it, a shadow moving across the ice. It wasn't walking, not exactly. The figure seemed to glide, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan watched, unable to move, as it disappeared into the darkness. The next day, Ethan ventured out to inspect the lake. The morning light revealed the vast expanse of ice, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything having been there. The experience unsettled him, but he told himself it must have been a wild animal or his imagination. He needed to focus on his work. That evening, as the sun set, the figure returned. This time it was closer to the cabin, standing at the edge of the lake. Ethan grabbed his camera, his instincts as a photographer taking over his fear. But when he looked through the lens, the figure wasn't there. Lowering the camera, he saw it again, clear as day, watching him. The figure began to move, its dark form gliding across the ice, heading straight for the cabin. Ethan's fear turned to panic. He locked the doors and closed the curtains, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. The knocking returned, louder this time, coming from all sides of the cabin. As the knocking grew more relentless, Ethan noticed something even more unnerving. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and move, as though alive. Every time he turned his head, they shifted slightly, darting across the walls and ceiling. His flashlight flickered, casting jagged beams of light that made the moving shadows even more terrifying. Ethan felt trapped, not just by the figure outside, but by the very cabin itself, which now felt like it was closing in on him. Just before dawn, Ethan heard something he couldn't explain. Amidst the wind and knocking, there was a low, guttural whisper, his name. Ethan. The sound sent chills down his spine, and he clamped his hands over his ears, refusing to listen. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder and more insistent, as if coming from every direction. By morning, the noises stopped. Ethan cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The snow was untouched, the ice undisturbed, yet the sense of unease lingered. He packed his belongings and left the cabin that day, abandoning the rest of his trip. Weeks later, Ethan reviewed the photos he had taken during his stay. Among the images of frozen landscapes and wildlife, one picture stood out. Taken near the lake, it showed a faint, shadowy figure in the distance, just barely visible, but undeniably there. Ethan never returned to Alaska. The memory of the shadow on the ice and the figure that seemed to defy explanation haunts him to this day. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more creepy stories. Which of these stories gave you a chilling experience? Let us know. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are real.